Respected participants, a very warm welcome to GMA webinar. It is our privilege to have with us today Dr. Ritu Bhalla from IFF as the speaker from industry. To formally begin the webinar, I would now invite the IFF team to introduce the speaker. May I now request Mr. Arun to kindly take over. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rekha, and thank you, Gema, for giving us an opportunity to conduct this webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for taking out your time to attend this webinar. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Arun Kumar. I'm the commercial lead for the grain processing business in South Asia for IFF. For today's session, I will be your moderator, and we will be talking on one of the most important processes that happen in an ethanol plant, and that is liquefaction. In ethanol production, we often spend a lot of time talking about fermentation performance, yeast health, downstream recovery, and so on. But today we have deliberately shifted our entire spotlight upstream, and that is a step which is often treated as a routine, yet quietly determines what really is the outcome in an ethanol plant. Because in reality, liquefaction is not just a process step, it's a battleground where viscosity, heat, shear, enzyme choice, operating discipline all collide. And it's often where ethanol yield is either protected or irreversibly lost. And that's the focus for today's session. Liquefaction, the hidden battleground where ethanol yield is won or lost. Now, to talk on this very important topic, today we have our speaker, Dr. Ritu Bhalla. She is the regional application leader based out of our application center in Hyderabad. She and her team supports the ethanol customers across the Asia Pacific region, right from South Asia, Southeast Asia, to countries like Australia and New Zealand. She holds a PhD in biotechnology and has over 15 years of experience in the ethanol industry. In the past, she has also worked on development of advanced biofuel technologies and has contributed significantly to various patents and publications on this topic. So over to you, Ritu.
Thanks, Arun. Thank you for the kind introduction and also a very good introduction to the topic. A very good afternoon to all of you. I'll also thank the GEMA for providing us this platform where we can share knowledge, learn from each other. So thank you so much to GEMA. Next slide, Arun. This is the content of my webinar today, and the idea is as Arun mentioned, liquefaction process being a very important process. What I'm going to try to do today is to provide you tools and information to make the right decision, to troubleshoot and make the right choices, right? So that's the whole goal of my presentation today. And I have divided my presentation into 4 parts. In the first part, we'll talk a bit about the science behind liquefaction, what really happens during liquefaction and how can we track it. The second part of my presentation will be focusing on the factors that influence liquefaction performance, right? What can impact, what can improve, and what can actually make you lose or have a bad liquefaction. So that's the second piece. Then in the third part of my presentation, we'll talk a few troubleshooting cases. We'll take some case studies and see how to troubleshoot it. And then last but not the least, we'll talk about enzymes as the problem solver. How can you make the right choices, and what do you need to know to choose the right enzyme? During my webinar today, I would like to keep it very interactive. So, what we have decided to do today is we will launch a few polls. There will be a question that will appear on your screens if you are using, an app on your mobile, or if you're joined from the laptop, then you should be able to participate in the poll. I would encourage you to participate in these polls. You'll see a few choices. Just, click on the right choice and submit the question. The other thing that we would, you can do is, if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to submit the questions, right? We will take up questions at the end of the webinar. Some of them we will try to, respond on the Q&A tab itself, and some of them we will take live. So please submit your questions as they come to your mind, because sometimes what happens is then, later on we will miss those important questions. So let's get started. We will launch our first poll now. And the question that you would see on your screens is, why do we need a good liquefaction? Why is liquefaction so important? Now, let me tell you, all of these, responses are correct. So, you choose the response that makes most sense to you. Again, none of them are wrong. So, just submit your response, and we will give a few seconds for everybody to participate, and then we will share the results. And the results will also come on your screen. So once you have submitted, just let's give a few more seconds so that we have the maximum participation. Again, if you're not using the app on the mobile, then you may not be able to see this, but otherwise on laptops and mobile, where you're using app, you should be able to see the poll appearing on your screens now. Can we have the results now? All right, so we already have a lot of results, and as I said earlier, also none of these responses are wrong. So all of them are the right responses, and actually the ones which have the highest ones minimize starch losses, producing dextrin, reducing viscosity, and solubilize the starch. Yes, the liquefaction process just helps us achieve all of that, right? It is very important process because we have to solubilize the starch and break it down to dextrins, so that then later on the GA can further break it down to glucose and make food for the yeast. Also, if we, just imagine, starch, if you, heat the starch, how viscous it can be. So it is important to break down the viscosity so that your, mash is flowable through the system and can, continue to the other part of the process. So thank you. So let's get into the next section. The next section, as I said, is, we'll talk about the science behind liquefaction. So we'll actually first see what happens and then how do we track it. So next slide, please. So during the liquefaction process, there are two phenomena that are simultaneously happening. One is the uncooked starch gelatinization, right? So the gelatinization process, the uncooked starch actually absorbs water as the temperature goes up. And then the dextrinization process kicks in when the enzyme starts to break down the starch into dextrin. During the gelatinization process, there is a viscosity increase. And then during the dextrinization process, there is a viscosity decrease. So, you will mostly we don't see the gelatinization, the peak viscosity, but, that's actually what happens. So, once your mash comes out, you see a very flowable, mash. Next slide, we have actually a video to, give you a visual of what actually happens to it.
Uncooked starch. Heated to 55 degrees Celsius. Heated to 75 degrees Celsius. Heated to 85 degrees Celsius. Heated to over 90 degrees Celsius. Alpha amylases are biological catalysts that accelerate the breakdown of starch into dextrins. This process reduces viscosity and enhances the flowability of the slurry.
I hope hope this video helped you visualize the process. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about a few simple tests that you can use to track this process, right? What are the simple KPIs that help us know whether a liquefaction is going on well or not? The first very important one is iodine test. It's a very simple test. There's something called iodine solution, a reagent, very, easily available. You can, add a few drops of that to your liquefact and then wait for the color to appear. Color of reddish brown to yellow is a good iodine, which means that the iodine is negative, which means there is no starch left. Now, this is one test where, you can celebrate a negative result. Remember the color reddish brown to yellow. So that's the color you're looking for. And that actually tells you that your starch has broken down into dextrins. Next slide. Next is dextrose equivalent or DE. Now, in the plants, we normally actually just test RS. So, that's a very common test. Again, there is a Felling titration method, and, we see all the labs testing it. So, RS is a number that can be used to then convert into DE. In scientific terms, we actually like to use DE because it is more normalized to DS as well. Now, again, there is a range between 12 to 19 DE is a good DE. And and that just tells you whether you're, you have a good dextrin profile and, you have, the alpha amylase is working well. At this point, we will launch our next poll. And the question over here is, what is the RS number that you like to see? Or, what is the ideal D or the RS number? So you have the D number as well. And in the choice, you also have the RS number. So click on the number that, in your plants, you normally target. Let's wait a few more seconds for everyone to share. Again, there is no right or wrong answer. We just, want everybody to submit their responses so that we know, like, what is the spread, what's the RS you normally target or like to see. Can we share the results? Okay. Yeah. So again, a nice spread, right? So different plants, different RS number, and that's totally fine. I know, you must be thinking, what is the ideal RS? Now, next slide, please. So there is actually no ideal RS or DE number. It, this number is basically a very, characteristic to each plant, feedstock, and most importantly, the alpha amylase that you are using, right? So here I have given the examples of 3 alpha amylase, and, on the right side, I have the DE number that you achieve. Now, each alpha amylase being an enzyme, it has a different cutting pattern. वो अलग-अलग काटता है. Like, some of them will give you very high DP10, किसी का DP3 high होगा, किसी का DP4 high होगा. And this is the DP profile which, you get if you use HPLC. Again, in the plants, we don't, see the DP profile because most plants don't have HPLC. But ye number, if you use different alpha amylase in the lab, we will get this number. The significance of this number is, as I said earlier, कि हर plant का, depending on the process, depending on the feedstock, and depending on the alpha amylase, you will have a number. As long as you have not changed anything, you should get the same number. Let's say अगर आप normally एक आपका RS आता है 4.5 using corn and all the other particular, let's say alpha amylase है, and you have not changed anything. आप corn भी same use कर रहे हैं, आप DS भी same use कर रहे हैं, आपका temperature भी same है, alpha amylase भी same है, then you should continue to get that number because that number tells you कि आपका process ठीक से काम कर रहा है कि नहीं. But अगर, if you have changed the alpha amylase, if you've changed it to, let's say, another alpha amylase, or if you have changed the feedstock from corn to rice, then that number can change. Then do not chase the same number because that can cause more problem because, then what you start to impact is your DP profile. And next click. And that is very important, right? You don't want your lower DP profile, which is DP1, DP2, and DP3 to be very inconsistent, right? So आपका DP1 normally 1 to 2% के बीच में होना चाहिए, उससे ज़्यादा नहीं होना चाहिए, because ज़्यादा हुआ तो, it will create stress on the yeast. So that's why when you're using a particular alpha amylase, you can continue to change that number as long as you have not changed anything. But when you have changed your alpha amylase, आपने दूसरा alpha amylase use किया, तो आप कोशिश कीजिए कि आप उसका optimal RS check कर लीजिए, and then you use that number as your benchmark, and not change, use same number from a previous alpha amylase. So that's very important, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody understands that here. Next, again, this is another very important indicator of good liquefaction. If your viscosity is low at the end of the liquefaction, that's actually a good liquefaction to have. Now, viscosity, again, we don't measure, right, at the plant. दिखता हमारे पास इक्विपमेंट्स प्लांट पे नहीं रहते हैं, ये अगेन हम लैब में कर सकते हैं, बट प्लांट पे नहीं होता. बट विस्कोसिटी इज आल्सो समथिंग वेरी विजुअल. आपको दिखेगा, यू कैन सी बिटवीन द टू गुड विस्कस, गुड विस्कोसिटी एंड अ बैड विस्कोसिटी. आपको समझ आ जाएगा कि ये आज बहुत अच्छा पतला लिक्विफैक्ट है, अच्छा है. सो also viscosity, there are two types of viscosity. There is a peak viscosity, which normally we don't see. This happens during the first stage, the gelatinization phase. Terminal viscosity is something that we actually see, because it happens you can see it at the end of your process, and that's the viscosity that your pumps see, or your tubes and everything see. So you will actually visualize this viscosity. I have two visuals over here to show you what is a good viscosity and what is a bad viscosity. So can we play that? Yeah. So you see it's a very flowable, very good liquefact. It's a good viscosity, right? काफी पतला and अच्छा flow है. Then second one, this you can see is very thick, very sticky also. So this is not a good liquid. Sometimes इससे भी ज़्यादा खराब होता है, but this one at least is flowing. But the left one is what you really want to achieve at the end of your liquefaction. And जैसे मैंने बोला, viscosity, maybe we don't have the equipment to test it, but at least we can, visually see the difference, right? The left one is a good one, the right one is a thick one. So with, when you're using your alpha amylase, you would always want to get the one in the left. Okay. So before I jump into my next, part, there's another thing I wanted to talk about is jet cooker, right? A lot of our customers ask us, jet cooker use kare ki nahi kare? Is jet cooker important? Is jet cooker, useful, beneficial? So before I talk about it, one important thing to note is whether you use jet cooker or you don't use jet cooker, you need to use enzymes. Alpha amylases are an important part of your liquefaction process. Jet cooker does not replace alpha amylase, which means that your OPEX cost is going to be same in both of these cases. What will change, and what the benefit that jet cooker can give you is in situations when your like the quality of feedstock is very poor, काफी खराब corn होता है कभी कभी, very fibrous, and you're not able to break down or release the fiber bound starch. That's when the jet cooker can help, and in subsequent slides I'll talk a bit more about it, but that's something to remember. But jet cooker also comes with some drawbacks, that it is a high capex. It also is extensive energy requirement, and it leads to a bit of sugar degradation that makes you lose a bit of your yield. So about 1% yield is what up to 1% you can lose if you are using a jet cooker versus not using a jet cooker, because there's a sugar degradation, and that degraded sugar cannot be used by the yeast. So that's something important to note. Next slide. Now, that brings us to second part of our, webinar, where we are going to talk about the important factors that influence liquefaction performance. Some things to keep in mind while we are doing liquefaction, so that we can then make the right choices of the process conditions, the enzymes, and everything. So, next slide. So the first important parameter is feedstock. what are you using? What is the feedstock and what is the quality of that feedstock? Now, there are different feedstock that people use, and most popular ones are corn and rice. They vary in their starch content, protein content, fiber content. For example, corn may starch is slightly less than in rice, fiber is more than in rice, and similarly in rice also, there's a raw rice, there's a parboiled rice, so all of them. But these composition, as long as you're dosing your enzyme on starch basis, you should be able to take care of that composition part. But what is other important aspect of a feedstock is also how your starch is present in the feedstock, like how your starch is matrix. For example, corn may especially, all the starch is not freely available. We don't have that kind of corn available in India that they have in US. The one we have in, India, we have a lot of fiber bound starch. We have a lot of protein bound starch. There is a matrix in which the starch is present, and not necessarily all the enzymes are able to access it. You need the right blend of the enzyme to be able to access this. Also, in the case of rice, especially parboiling process, the rice which has gone through the parboiling process, there is something called resistant starch. Now, this starch is formed during the parboiling process, where the lipid that is present in the husk that combines with the amylose, or the starch that is present, to make a amylolipid complex. Some, in simple terms, starch or oil का एक complex form हो जाता है, and that is resistant starch, and again it is difficult to break down. And you would have noticed sometimes when, there's a lot of parboiled rice that you use, so starch at the end of, fermentation is, increases. And that's exactly. Now, these are, situations where jet cooker can help. Again, there are enzymes and newer enzymes blends that are available that you can use in these conditions and break it down. But, these are, again, choices to make. If you want jet cooker, then, this is something where you can actually see the benefit. And again, there can be, variable amounts of fiber-bound starch, protein-bound starch, and, resistant starch that can be present up to, sometimes, 3 to 5% in some cases. So this is very important to know. And this is the data we are presenting from one of the literatures only, right? Next slide. Yeah, so the next one is the particle size, right? The particle size distribution is, so that's the other important parameter. Now, how does the particle size distribution change if there is poor milling, if there is bad feedstock quality, if we are using a wrong screen or a clogged screen, then the particle size distribution can vary, right? There is always a preferred particle size distribution. In my chart below, I'm showing what is the right preferred particle size. Again, the particle size can vary, but what is the preferred particle size? Typically, a screen size of 2 to 2.5 is what gets you to a good particle size. So, as you can see, about your average particle size should be around 0.6, and your coarse, which is, 0.8 to 1 mm, should be less than 50%. And your oversized specifically should be, oversizes any particle more than 1.2 mm should not be present. So you shouldn't have that, that kind of, oversized particles. So if that is the kind of particle size you have, then, you get the best efficiencies. The chart on the right basically shows you. So, from left to, you can see that as your particle size goes down, your ethanol titer, and again, this comes from one of the literature, your ethanol titer keeps going up, and this is assuming that everything else is same, which means that your recoveries are going up. Now, if you have very fine particle size, which is the one 0.5, you can also get a higher recovery, but you have to be careful, because at these particle sizes, then your downstream can be a challenge. You can start to see separation issues in your downstream. So the preferred particle size still remains within this limit of 2 to 2.5 screen size. So again, that's something to remember. Yeah, so can we move on to the next slide? Yeah, so so again, the next one is pH, and here again we will launch a poll. So what is the pH that you are running your liquefaction at? Again, you can choose one of the choices and submit. We'll wait a bit for the results. All right, maybe we should get the results. All right. So again, a wide range, right? There are, most of the participants, about 40%, 5.2 to 5.6, and 45%, 4.8 to 5.2. And then, some of them also lower than 4.8, right? And again, we understand, like, the industry is actually moving towards lower and lower pH. So this makes sense. Now, let's get back to this slide. So why does the pH change, right? Why is the industry moving? So with all the ZLD coming in, there is higher and higher recycle that is happening. Of course, chemical savings are another reason. You don't want to, spend a lot of money on chemical savings. Lower fresh water is also one reason that, you can see lower pHs, and then higher infections. So if you have higher infections in your fermenter, then also, sometimes, with all the recycle streams coming in, your pH can drop, right? So it can go to lower and lower, and that's fine, right? There is no right or wrong pH. It's just that you have to know that, if you have such lower pH conditions, you have to make the right choice of the enzyme. Now, and if you don't, then there is potential to lose productivity. You can have sugar losses, and also other issues in your downstream. On my right, I'm showing two examples of what really happens if you are not making the right enzyme choice. Now, conventional enzyme, let's talk about a conventional alpha amylase. So there's a conventional and there is an advanced alpha amylase. So conventional alpha amylases are alpha amylases that actually are functional in a narrower pH range, so something like 5.2 to 5.6 or 5.2 and above. And as you expose them to lower pH, if you bring them down to pHs of 5, 4.8, they become inactive because they're proteins. They are not designed to work under these conditions. So what will happen is, if you expose them to these pHs, they will stop acting, and then they will leave a lot of starch, and that can show up in your iodine positive. And remember, I said this is one test which negative is good, not the positive. So you will see that. On the other hand, if you're using, advanced alpha amylases, these are very robust alpha amylases. They can get exposed to any pH, anything like even 4.6, 4.8, and they can still be active because that's how they've been designed to work, right? They can, work under lower pHs of 4.6 and 4.8. And we saw that, there was 15%, participants who said that, they're using lower pH as well. So these are alpha amylases that can also act under these conditions and give you a negative iodine, which is good, which means your starch is broken down, right? So that's something to always remember. Next slide. The other important parameter that can impact your liquefaction performance and also impact your alpha amylase is ions. There is not much testing of iron that happens at the plant. There are simple kits that are available, and oftentimes when me and my team, we go for trials, we carry those kits to, just check the ions and then make the right choice. As I said, right, it's important to know. So why do the ions vary, or why would the ions change or drop down? So lower ions could be as a result of, if let's say you're not using caustic, or you're not adjusting your pH using caustic and you're using liquor ammonia, that could be one of the reasons. Or if you're again using higher recycles, lower fresh water. And again, the impact is the same because, you're really impacting your alpha amylase, and if you've not chosen the right alpha amylase. So, you lose starch, you lose sugars, and, there'll be downstream impact. Now, again, in the chart, I'm trying to show what really happens. Again, two examples, conventional alpha amylase, advanced alpha amylase. In case of conventional alpha amylase, now you can see, right, we are showing 2 pH. There is performance at pH 5.4, which is something that the alpha amylase is good at, right? This conventional alpha amylase should work at 5.4. But hota kya hai that, the alpha amylase, when even if the pH is right, even if the pH is 5.4, when it goes to lower sodium concentration, you can see it towards, the left, 40 ppm, that's when this is not the ideal ion concentration for this conventional alpha amylase. So it again starts to leave your starch and give you iodine positive. Similar, if you look on the chart below, advanced alpha amylase, no matter what pH, so 4.6, 5.4, or no matter what your ion concentration is. In fact, even lower than 40 ppm, 30 ppm, these alpha amylase, they continue to work seamlessly. They give you the same results. There is no impact on their performance, and they will continue to give you iodine negative, or, they will continue to break down all the starch, what we are expecting them to do. In fact, the enzyme companies like us, we are continuing to, do our innovation to move towards more and more robust alpha amylase, more ion independent alpha amylase, more temperature, tolerant alpha amylase, or more pH tolerant alpha amylase, because we also understand that's the industry need, right? As the industry is moving towards the requirement of operating at lower and lower pH, these are the, alpha amylases that are now available. You can choose from them and, make sure that your process runs well. Next slide. Liquefaction temperature is also important. And again, why is the liquefaction temperature changing? Like, again, with the more and more energy, extensive energy integrations, now the customers are liking to operate at a higher temperature, right? So it's going up. At one point it used to be 88, 90, now 92, and even sometimes 94, 95, right? So those are the temperatures, like, that's continuing. The good news is that as your liquefaction temperature goes up, initially you will see an improvement in your recovery. Again, this is data from one of the publications, and as you can see that up to 92, 90, 92, so these temperatures are plus minus 2. So if you're seeing 90, that actually means 92 also. So you can see an improvement in the recovery, and that's because, your starch breakdown is good and everything, you get also a good, the enzyme action. So you get a good response, right? But if you exceed, let's say 95, 96, that's when, again, you have to be careful making the right choices. And this is, data from, maybe not using a completely, stable, tolerant alpha amylase. So you can see a drop, right? So there's a recovery drop. So again, we have to be careful making the right choices, choosing the right products as we are doing our liquefaction processes. All right. Liquefaction DS. Now, I think this, everybody understands there are, liquefaction DS. People are, as you go to higher DS, you would expect high viscosity, right? There is always a viscosity increase. So let's say, we have a graph over here showing 28 and 32. 32, you would expect a high peak viscosity. And as you see towards the end, the viscosity drops down, but there's still a difference. The higher, DS will always have a high viscosity. The chart on the right actually is more important, where I'm, trying to show that when you are operating at high DS, that's when you have to be more careful with your particle size. Now, here I have two cases. One is 3 plants that are operating at 32 DS. Now, one plant uses a particle size where it has a higher coarse, and plant 2 and 3, they have medium or lower coarse. So if they are operating at 32, all 3 of them, while there is still a slightly higher viscosity in plant 1 because of the coarse, but still they should be able to operate because it's still not that, high. But now if 3 of these plants shift to a higher DS, let's say they want to operate a DS of 35, right? That's when they have to be extra careful. That's when you can see in the case of plant 1, there is significant increase in the viscosity. Now this plant will see, issues with their pump pressures and everything. So you can see the viscosity shot up is so high just because of the particle size. So when you're operating higher DS, then you have to be extra careful with your particle size, because a higher particle size can lead to a much higher viscosity increase than in the case of the lower DS. Well, next slide again. So now let's talk about another very important, thing called phytic acid. So we call it a hidden trap. Why do we call it a hidden trap? I'll explain you in a little bit. Now, phytic acid is an organic form of phosphorus that exists in the feedstock itself. It is already present in corn and other feedstock. It is quite high in corn. So you can see on our screen we are showing. So it's about 1% on the corn. In case of rice, it is lower, but it's still there, right? So this is what is already present in the feedstock. And why do we call it a trap? What does it really do? So during the liquefaction process, what happens is this phytic acid, and at high temperature, it starts to bind to all the cations that are present. It also binds to protein and also carbohydrate. And carbohydrate is nothing but your starch. What it does then is it makes a phytate complex. Now this complex has is already binding to a lot of your cations, carbohydrate and protein, making them unavailable. Now we already saw these cations are important for your alpha amylase function. Carbohydrate, if they bind to carbohydrate, which means now you will actually lose the starch, right? The starch yeast will not be able to access. So that's actually not good. So, and it's not easy to break down. Once this complex is found, this is not easy to break down. You need the particular enzyme to break it, and that's called phytase, and you need a thermostable phytase. Now, if you want to break it down, you need to add this thermostable phytase in the liquefaction conditions, and what this will do is this will break down the phytic complex and release inositol. And inositol is nothing but what you get after breaking down your phytic acid. It will release the cations, it will release protein and carbohydrate also, because all of this now complex has broken down. Carbohydrate, release will help you get lower starch, especially in case of, corn. Inositol actually is a very good yeast nutrient. So if it is released at the right time during the fermentation, you would see a benefit in, the yeast action and fermentation yield. All your cations now, are also available for your enzyme, right? So your, next click. So these cations are available for your enzyme. It will stabilize your enzyme. So, you will have a better enzyme action. And also, very importantly, it releases inorganic phosphorus, right? Now, those of you are familiar with the animal feed industry. Phytase is an enzyme that the animal feed industry actually adds to, their animal feed or DDGS to release this inorganic, because actually phytic acid is also an anti-nutrient. So it actually releases inorganic phosphorus. Now, if you're already adding it to your process, you should actually, you're actually increasing the value of your DDGS. Now, maybe you will argue at this point, we are not getting a good value, but, this is something our industry should move towards, because this is, worldwide, this is added already in the animal feed. In fact, in US, they already added to their processes and get a good value of their DDGS. The other hidden benefit of breaking down this phytate complex or, phytic acid in the liquefaction is also this helps with fouling. We have seen that already, that, customers who use the enzymes with phytic acid in their liquefaction process, they observe a very low fouling after their, in their PHEs and later on in the process. So that's another hidden benefit. So this is actually a very important enzyme, and, we should consider trialing it. Next. So that brings us to the end of our second section. And now we will move on to our third part, which is troubleshooting. So we will now share with you a few case studies and see, what what should you do? So let's say, you observe high viscosity in liquefact. We saw that sticky, liquefact. So if you are seeing that, what should you do? So the first thing is that, if you're seeing high viscosity, the first thing to check is the alpha amylase dose right? Sometimes we have seen, because we do rely on manual adding, right? People are adding it. So if you have skipped one addition, or if you've not, for some reason, a low alpha amylase dose has gone inside the liquefaction. So that could be one of the reasons, because you need the sufficient dose to break down the viscosity or break down the starch chains, right? The second reason could be the high DS. So if your DS has suddenly increased due to either some miscalculation or something, or maybe sometimes a deliberate intent to increase the DS, then you have to accordingly manage the dose. So if that has increased, the viscosity will automatically go up. We already saw that in our data earlier. Particle size is also another reason. Again, we showed you data, right? Bigger particle size, you have to be careful, because a bigger particle size will lead to a higher viscosity. And of course, there are other, enzyme parameters. If all of these three things are fine, and everything is looking good, then just make sure that the pH is okay and it is matched with the right enzyme. If you're using an enzyme that requires higher pH, then you will have to look into it. And then also agitation, right? Enzymes work only if they are mixed well. If you've just added it and if it is not mixed well in the system, then that could be one of the reasons that your enzymes will not be able to function. So you'll see high viscosity, and you'll see other problems as well. So those things are how you can troubleshoot this. Next slide. Iodine positive now, or iodine positive, I told you, right? One test that you don't want positive. So, or that actually means that your starch has not solubilized completely. Again, how do you troubleshoot it? The first thing to go check is, is the temperature in your tank okay, right? If there is an incorrect temperature, lower temperature, sometimes it will start to impact your starch solubilization. And if the starch is not solubilized well, you'll tend to see a positive iodine as well. Again, if there is uneven heating also, maybe, at some point, at one point there is good heating, but if the other point in the liquefaction tank, the heating is not well, there are cold spots that can lead to, lumps getting formed, and that can also give you an iodine positive. Third thing, again, if you're not, again, the pH is not optimal and not matched with the alpha amylase, so alpha amylase cannot work well. So that could be one reason. Higher particle size, again, bigger particle size, the alpha amylase don't get the right, surface area to act, because, you need the right particle size for even the enzyme to act on the starch. And if there have been some recent changes in, if everything else looks good, agitation is good, sab kuch theek hai, then, could be ki, there is some changes in the slurry makeup. Aapne suddenly zyada recycle dala hai, kuch hai, and there is, an enzyme instability reason that can happen. So it's always good to check, that as well. DE and DE, you can also see maybe improper RS, because I know not everybody is very familiar with this term. So DE and RS can be synonymously used. So jo bhi hai. So if you're not getting the right RS. So again, I talked about it earlier. RS is a very characteristic of the alpha amylase on a particular plant, on a particular feedstock. Agar aapka enzyme change hua hai, then you definitely have to see, accept that there could be a different DE or a different RS that you're getting. Bahut often hai, we go to trials and we are doing alpha amylase trial, there are different RS, thoda sa zyada hota hai ya thoda sa kam hota hai, and the customers panic, which is fine, because, it's a very important process. So everybody, are very cautious. But, if the moment that changes, if their enzyme is changing, then, there is a possibility that this number will change. So you have to, stay a little bit, patient, and then let that process stabilize. But still, if let's say you've not changed anything, kuch bhi change nahi kiya, and then you're not achieving your RS or D, then this is something to worry about, because this is a number. If nothing has changed, then this is a number that should stay consistent, and that gives you a good indication of कि आपका process ठीक से काम कर रहा है कि नहीं. Then I'll say go check your alpha amylase. अगर कुछ ठीक से डोज नहीं हुआ है, टेम्परेचर pH ठीक नहीं है, एजिटेशन ठीक नहीं है, आयंस ठीक नहीं है, all of that, then those could be, if let's say a sudden drop in the pH and alpha amylase काम नहीं करे, then that could be also one of the reasons where your RS number will change, because RS number, if nothing else changes, then RS number actually should not change. It is a indicator of a good consistent liquefaction. Next. High pressure in liquefaction. So, the mash is thicker. So we saw, right? Thicker mash means high viscosity. Again, could be dry solid changes. It could be also a pump issue. Kai bari hota hai pump, there's pump malfunction and improper flow. So, we panic ki kya ho gaya? Hame lagta hai viscosity बढ़ गया, but actually it is a pump issue. So that could be one of the reasons. Or it could be a particle size issue. Check your sifters, check your conical screens, if there could be a clogging or something. So, those are things to also go check. Next slide. So this is, we have many more cases, but this is, something I wanted to share, a fast decision tree, right? Quickly कैसे decisions ले सकते हैं, कैसे पता चले क्या करना है, some first तो आप अपना you check your KPIs, your viscosity is going up, DE और RS कम हो रहा है, या फिर pump pressure बढ़ रहा है, या फिर iodine positive है, then check your alpha amylase, check pH temperature, check particle size, agitation ठीक है कि नहीं, cold spots तो नहीं है, ions ठीक है कि नहीं, and then even nothing, everything else looks okay, then it could be that if the enzyme is not stored properly, enzyme has lost the activity also, because मैंने आपको बताया these are proteins, they can lose activity. So those could be one of the reasons. बहुत पुराना enzyme है, yeah. So those are things to check. So this is just a fast decision tree for any operator. I hope that part was useful. Now let's move on to the last part of my presentation, where I'm going to share the enzymes in our portfolio that you can choose from, and how do you make the right choice. Now, the first two enzymes I want to talk about is Spezyme Pro and Spezyme HPT. Spezyme Pro has been a flagship product for a long time. A lot of our customers use it. It is one of those enzymes that delivers fastest viscosity break, and it delivers lowest viscosity, especially when the conditions are normal, right? If your conditions, if your pH is above 5.2, if you have a good control of everything, pH, temperature, then this is the enzyme. It's a very good enzyme, lowest viscosity break, nothing can beat it. The other, enzyme in our portfolio, which can, delivers very fast and, fast viscosity break is Spezyme HT. Again, very cost-effective, speed and productivity. So if that matters to you, this is the enzyme to go after. This is something that we have recently launched. Again, it is getting very popular. So, these are the enzymes that you should try if all the conditions are normal. Again, you need more information, please reach out to one of our sales representatives to get more details. The other two enzymes I wanted to impress upon are Spezyme HN and Spezyme HTE. If you, a few slides back, I talked about phytic acid, right? And the benefits of breaking down that phytic acid. So Spezyme HN is one of our products which has the thermostable phytase, which can help you break down the phytic acid and get all the benefits like lower starch, performance under harsh liquefaction conditions, it releases all the ions, and it also helps with fouling, and also, of course, there's a potential to get a good, DDGS value using this enzyme. So that's Spezyme HN, which has the thermostable phytase. Spezyme HTC has, one of our newest launches, one of our workhorse alpha for one of the harshest condition, the highest temperatures, low pH, low ion. this is one of our toughest, or one of the most robust enzyme that can work under toughest liquefaction conditions. So again, if you're interested in either knowing more about it or trialing it, please reach out to our sales representative. So that's our, that's what I wanted to share. And again, thank you very much for your kind attention. And I will now hand it over to Arun to, for Q&A. Thank you.
For the very informative session. While you were giving the presentation, I already see that there are some questions that have come in. One of the questions that I see here is, we do not use, one of our colleagues has asked, we do not use the iodine test on a daily basis at our plant. How important is this test, to judge the performance of liquefaction?
A very relevant question. Thank you for asking that. I totally understand that, if you're not doing iodine test on regular basis, it's fine. It's a very good test, very simple test, while I will encourage everybody to do it all the time. But, if you cannot do it, then it is important to use this test, especially when you have, some trouble. Like, let's say you have a lot of starch left over in your fermentation and you want to know what is exactly happening. So this is a test that you can use to track your liquefaction and make sure that, your liquefaction has actually performed well, right? So if you can't do it on a routine basis, then at least use it for troubleshooting. It is a very good troubleshooting tool. It is a very simple tool that you can use at the plant. You don't need a very specialized equipment or anything. You just need an iodine, and and you can do it. And if you need any help there, again, we can help train.
Yeah, so very valid point. And I think, iodine test really helps in defining, how good the liquefaction has been. The second question that I see here is, how does the quality of liquefaction determine the residual starch remaining in the fermenter wash at the time of transfer to the beer well?
Again, great question. So a good liquefaction, as I told in the beginning, a good liquefaction gives you that head start, right? If you have a good liquefaction, then you can, just rest assured that, your fermentation, you will not lose a lot of starch, at least, right? Yeah, as long as the yeast and everything is working. A good liquefaction kind of guarantees you lower residual starch at the end. Now, these days there are very advanced glucoamylases also present. So those glucoamylases have blends of alpha amylases in them. So if you these days, in fact, sometimes if you don't have a good liquefaction, then also if you're using one of these advanced glucoamylases, then you will be able to break down the starch even during your fermentation and be able to release that dextrin that point of time. But again, good liquefaction just gives you that guarantee. At least you've done one step very well. So that's what I will say. But yeah, it's not like if there is some starch left over in the liquefaction, it cannot be taken care in the fermentation. Just make sure you're using the right enzyme in the fermentation as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I think a very valid point, while it's important to have a good liquefaction, but just in case there is some starch carry over to the fermentation, we do have enzymes, which can work at low temperature for conversion of any leftover starch, even in the fermenters. We have an enzyme called as distillase CS, which can be used. So yeah, so very valid point. Another question is, what is the optimal or ideal reducing sugar level during liquefaction?
Again, good question. I think I also tried to address that during my presentation, and I'll share again. So RS, there is no perfect RS number, right? The RS number is very characteristic of alpha amylase, a process, a feedstock. And, if you change any of those, then expect this to change. But if you have not changed anything, then an RS is a good indicator of your process running consistently. typically we get RS numbers somewhere in the range of 4.2 to 5.4%, and that's a good range anytime. But just make sure that your DP1s are not very high and you're not stressing your yeast later on. So there is no one number, there's a range. 4.2 to 5.4 is a good range to be in, but expect it to change when you have made some changes in your plant.
Yeah, very valid point. Something in terms of process conditions, if they have changed, there would be a change in the RS number. And of course, when you probably change the alpha amylase, you can also see some change in the RS numbers. Another question, what precautions have to be taken during the dosing of enzymes, especially alpha amylase?
I think this is something, that I actually would like to also share myself. So alpha amylases are proteins, right? These are enzymes. These are biological macromolecules. So you should see them as something that if you have done any damage to these are irreversible, right? So these are, while we are, I told you earlier, right? We are innovating towards more and more robust alpha amylases, but you should always read what is the pH these alpha amylases work at, and what are the conditions that these will work. So when you are using these alpha amylases, there are certain precautions you should always take, because these are proteins, because these are macromolecules, they are liable to getting damaged, right? So for example, do not add alpha amylase right next to your steam injection. These are like, if it is such a high temperature, then you can, directly kind of kill it. It's like, killing this enzyme. Do not mix it with urea and add. Do not mix it with ammonia and add, or do not even dilute it. Like, sometimes we have seen, people dilute it and then, you keep it. When we have made these proteins, we have stabilized them in certain formulations. You just manually add them and just keep them, like that. Don't dilute and keep them. If you have diluted, then you either use completely immediately or just throw it, because it's if it is not staying in the formulation, then it will not be stable. The other thing to be, always remember is, where do you store it? We go to plants and we see enzymes, and not just alpha amylase, even other enzymes being stored directly under the sunlight, right? That's not, ideal. Of course, I mean, if we always write, store them under cold conditions, and we understand that at plant you cannot have, a refrigerator, for example, to store so much enzyme, but at least store them under shade. If you have a room, store them in that room, so that there is no direct exposure, right? Do not directly expose them to harsh conditions. They are meant to work in liquefaction at high temperature, but doesn't mean that you can store them at also high temperature, right? They are meant to be stored under normal conditions, and when they are active, they can, when they are working, they can work under high temperature conditions for that 2 to 3 hours that you are using. So just make sure that those things are taken care of when you are especially using these alpha amylases, or any enzymes for that matter.
Yeah, very, very valid points to take care, especially in the plant. Yes, few more questions. What precautions can one take to control starch retrogradation in case if we need to hold the mash for 8 to 10 hours due to sudden boiler breakdown? And a follow-up question to that is, can retrograde starch be reliquefied?
So retrograded starch. So what happens is, if you have liquefaction, you've done your liquefaction and you've suddenly cooled it, right? That's when you get your retrograded starch. Retrograded starch is difficult to break down. So, you have to be extra careful when you're, so a slow cooling down, or, just making sure, because there's also a contamination risk. So you have to be careful, but, to prevent it, you don't make sudden changes in the, the temperature, and that can help you bring down the retrogradation. And once retrograded, it will it will be difficult to use it, and then you will again need a jet cooker and stuff like that. So it's something to be extra careful with.
Okay. Yeah, very valid question which can come across any of the plants. What is the good and bad impact of protease-based enzymes in processes?
So again, excellent question. Proteases are, excellent auxiliary enzymes when used in the right time and in the right dosage. Now, proteases actually provide free amino nutrition for yeast, which is very important, right? It's almost like you're making a ready-made food for the yeast, right? Otherwise, we had urea, and then yeast has to convert that urea into amino acid. But if you're using proteases, you actually break down the protein, and you can release the right food for the yeast. So every time, whether it is in liquefaction or it in fermentation, when you're using proteases, that can help you provide that right nutrition. I already showed that the proteases also help you access the starch, protein bound starch, right? So that you can do, right? So that can help. These days, with all corn oil technology coming in, protease also help you release the extra oil there, right? So all of that is very important. So protease help you break down the fibers and release the oil. So again, if you use protease under the right conditions, you can actually get benefits of it. But there are cases if you either overdose, or if you're not using it with the right feedstock. Some feedstock which have high protein, then if you're not using, then the soluble protein can cause viscosity. And especially in feedstock which have less fiber, let's take an example of, rice. In some cases, if you're not using the right dose at the right time, then you can cause some viscosity because of the soluble protein, and that you need to be careful of. But, if a feedstock like corn, protease are, excellent auxiliary enzymes to be used. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think considering the time, this will be the last question, that I think we can address. Is there an implication of liquefaction on the decanter and solid separation?
So, the thing is, if you're leaving a lot of starch, it's not just liquefaction, the entire process, right? If you're not doing proper milling, first of all, downstream is a very, very delicate process in the whole thing. If you do any imbalance upfront, then you are liable to see the impact in the downstream. If your particle size is not correct, very fine, then you will see a separation issue. If you're, as I told you, right, release a lot of soluble protein, then there will be viscosity in the downstream. If you've left a lot of unsolubilized starch, and, even during the fermentation that wasn't converted, then also you can have downstream issue. So downstream issue is basically some imbalance in upfront, and that you tend to see in the downstream. So I think those are the examples I can say. That's why it is also important. But, as long as your entire process, at the end of the process, you're able to convert all your starch, and your particle size is perfect, and, everything else is perfect, then, it shouldn't have implication. Not necessarily one piece does it. It's an imbalance that we do in the process that impacts the downstream.
Right. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Ritu. And I would like to thank also all the participants who joined the webinar and have been very interactive in the polling as well as the question answer session. And
Thank you.
now I would like to give back the session to Rekha from Gemma.
I think
Rekha?
we'll have to unmute Rekha.
We are very thankful to Dr. Ritu Bhalla ma'am as a valuable knowledge partner. Please accept a token of appreciation from Jima ma'am. Thank you all the participants for your time and participation. Thank you all. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Gemma, for the excellent platform. Thanks to all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.